Hello, MrShine here from HearthstonePlayers.com, bringing you another episode of my Arena Quiz series. For those of you who haven't seen one of these videos before, allow me to explain. I am working on recording a run in the arena for every class, prioritizing the less used ones in order to give beginners an idea on how to draft for those they don't have as much experience with. When we conduct the draft, I'll allow time between choices to give you a chance to make your own choice. Feel free to pause the video if you like, and take as much time as you need. Once the pause timer is up, I'll talk through the reasons I chose the cards I did, and we'll rank them according to their overall value. If you want to take the quiz, start by giving yourself 100 points. If you ever pick cards that I felt weren't as valuable as another option, you'll be docked a number of points based on the severity of the choice. In close calls, you might only lose a point, or even not lose anything, but in clearly obvious situations you might drop quite a bit by making a mistake. And at the end of the draft, take the number you're left with after deductions and see where you ranked. Maybe share the quiz with your friends so you can smugly inform them of how much better you are at Hearthstone than them. I've also heard scoring well on my quiz is directly correlated with success in both your professional career and your love life, so really you can't afford not to take this quiz. So with all that out of the way, in this video I'll be taking on a Shaman draft. Admittedly, Shaman is probably a bit more popular than the Priest and Warrior decks I've done earlier. In fact, Arena Mastery has them as the second most successful class in Arena below Mage. At least it's not Mage though, and I'm going to have to go to every class eventually, so for now we're just going to have to live with it. First off, let's look at what the Shaman excels at, and therefore what things we might be looking for when drafting. One area is board control. Shamans have a lot of ways to cheaply remove enemy minions with spells, and they also have the ability to buff minions and totems to trade up with other cards. The key is Shaman needs the board to get this value, so it's critical we get some sticky minions in the draft. Another thing Shaman is great at is late game. Why, you ask? Pretty much because of a single common card, the Fire Elemental. This card is one of the strongest 6-drops in the game, and at common rarity you can have a good chance of being offered at least one of these during your draft. Its body is slightly weak for its mana cost, but still respectable enough, but it's the combination of 3 damage that puts it over the edge. You want to fit as many of these bad boys into your deck as possible. So how about weaknesses? The biggest one in my opinion is the lack of board clear. I know, Lightning Storm is a fantastic card, and Shamans always have a chance at getting a spell power totem to make it even more frightening, but Lightning Storm is a rare card and therefore you're less likely to have them in your deck as opposed to, say, a Mage's Flame Strike, a Paladin's Consecration, or a Druid's Swipe. Another weakness is the Shaman's reliance on board control. It's usually a good idea in the mid to late game for the Shaman player to pump out totems every turn because establishing the board is critical for a Shaman to get more value from other cards or force the opponent to spend cards to remove them. But if you've lost the board or your opponent has smartly spent time to kill your board instead of going for face, you can be put in a tough spot. The O2 totems are easy to kill without damaging your opponent's minions, so unless you find a way to claw back into the game with your hand, your totems likely won't contribute very much when playing from behind. The final comment isn't as much a weakness as it is a nod to the added complexity of Shaman with the overload mechanic. A buy now, pay later mentality can make it hard for new players to choose the best path when deciding what to do. As always, try to think about the mana you'll have available the following turn when you consider using overload cards. They can be extremely potent because you'll effectively be able to boost yourself in tempo, but you'll want to make sure you don't go all in and be stuck without a good backup plan if things backfire. So with all that said, let's try to build a deck that can aggressively take over the early game, set up a solid mid game, which we can hopefully close out with an army of fire elementals. And now a final recap before I conduct the draft. Start with 100 points, pause if needed between picks, subtract from your total when you make picks I considered suboptimal, and then we can review at the end. Quick disclaimer, always treat the next card selection as if you picked identically to me before that. You could have made a very different deck than I, and if you are picking based on what you would have previously had, the quiz sort of falls apart. When picking based on synergy, use the deck I've already drafted to that point as the reference. Alright, let's get this show on the road. Arena Quiz Shaman Edition begins now. We start with a doozy. I'm not familiar enough with Sludge Belcher in the arena to dock it, so while I chose Twilight Drake here, I think both were acceptable. Lava Burst is also great, although I valued it slightly lower because mid-game beef is so important in the arena, and Shaman has a lot of other common solid removal cards to choose from later. I'd rather have an arena deck with solid minions and little removal than solid removal and poor minions. One pick in and this draft is already controversial. We talked about how Shamans love their board, and Stormwind Champion wholeheartedly agrees. A 2-mana 1/3 totem with abilities, or a 2/2 totem every turn? Yes please. Croc is an adequate 2-drop which is next up, but Wind Fury shouldn't be touched. Sometimes it's useful to close out a game with surprising burst damage, but it asks you to have a solid minion out on the board already to get the most value from it, and usually minions don't survive more than 2 hits anyways. When all is said and done, you will probably spend Wind Fury and the minion it buffs to kill 2 cards worth of minions, usually no net gain for a spell that's difficult to use effectively. Arena is about consistency, not flash. All the picks here were bad, so I didn't dock for Tidehunter or Harpy. I picked Tidehunter as less bad because it falls in line with the goal of Shaman, which is to establish the board. Although Tidehunter is easy to ping with hero abilities, I'm less down on it than many others might be because it will take a mage's turn 2 or turn 3 to kill just half of the Tidehunter, leaving behind a 1/1. If I'm not against a hero that can ping the 1 HP, then I have a good chance of drafting in other things to buff the weak minions to provide some good value. Personally, the only thing Wind Fury Harpy is good at is drawing removal, but it's one of the weaker 6-drops out there, and I'm hoping to save that slot for better options like Fire Elemental. Ancestral Healing is best when played on a minion that's already gotten value and is big enough to be worth healing, but it's too situational to be worth considering here. Once again, we want consistent solid cards that can stand alone in the arena, not reliant combo cards that become dead weight if you didn't have the deck or the hand to utilize them. 3/2s are common in the arena, so Forked Lightning often has a good chance at 2-for-1-ing your opponent. The downside is the overload is quite significant, so choose wisely when you want to cast this spell. Usually it's best played in conjunction with playing another minion on the board. Earthshock has its moments, specifically against Scarlet Crusader and Twilight Drake, but the 1 damage usually won't kill a single card outright, so you might be stuck generating negative card advantage. Priestess of Elune is probably the only 6-drop I consider worse than Wind Fury Harpy. Its stats are too bad, and its battlecry too useless. Om nom nom, look at those stats for 1 mana! Zombie Chow is a new member of the Arena Club, and I welcome it with open arms. But MrShine, you might say, it has negative death rattle. That's true, I would reply. However, if you're playing Zombie Chow in the early game, when you want to be playing a 1-drop, the death rattle might not even come into effect. Late game Zombie Chow is bad, just like most any 1-drop is bad. But I like this card a lot, and I'm happy to snatch it up. Stormwind Knight is a useful in a pinch card, but I think Zombie Chow is more useful. Patriarch is a bad 3-drop that rarely kills anything with its 1 damage, so it's usually negative card advantage. I'm going to be a harsh grader here because the only correct pick is Rockbiter. It's amazing cheap removal whose only downside is it might cost you a bit of face damage. An excellent tempo card that lets you play a minion and remove a minion at the same turn. Dust Devil sometimes lives the dream. If you're not playing against someone who is with a pinging hero ability, and if you get it early, and if the enemy can't remove it in some way. If it fizzles though, you basically lost your next turn since you'll be mana locked. Far too risky. Reincarnate for the purpose of the arena is like a 2-mana ancestral healing that doesn't give you taunt. Sometimes I guess you can remove an enemy's buff card with it, but it's far too situational for us to dare pick. Yeti is a top pick in the arena because it's a 4/5 on turn 4 that's hard to remove. For 1 more mana, Spectral Knight only gains 1 more HP, but his spell immunity makes him really difficult to remove. Usually the only way to kill Spectral Knight is to ram multiple minions into it and clear it with a weapon charge, plus another minion. It's super good, and I think it's the best neutral minion addition to the arena Naxxramas gave us. Razorfen isn't bad, but pales in comparison to our Sir Ghostly. And Stoneskin Gargoyle has the Patriarch problem in that it can't hurt things. It could be good with buffs, but Shamans don't have many buffs like Paladins or Druids do. Pass his ugly mug up. Croc is Croc. He does what you ask of him and not much else, but as a 2-drop often he'll do. Abusive Sergeant is easy to ping, although he's still an okay 1-drop, especially since there's a chance he'll be able to buff a totem to run into a minion. Harpy is still too slow and expensive for me to consider, and we have a bunch of time left to get some late game I'd actually be happy with. Croc, croc, croc. Crockety, croc, croc. I already talked about Dust Devil being crummy, and Grimscale has less risk but less reward as well. Nothing compelling here, so we croc it up. Okay, hear me out. I picked War Leader, but I might have been wrong. But I might have been right. It's close. Shade will usually accomplish the same thing as War Leader, a 3/3 for 3 you can attack with on turn 4, While Shade has the benefit of stealth, it's also clearable with Cleave, Forked Lightning, and Consecration before it gains the extra HP. War Leader has less upside, but I do have one Tidehunter so far, so there's a very little bit of minion synergy there, although it can also backfire on me if the enemy has Murlocs. So it's debatable, and in hindsight I might have gone Shade in the future. At least I think we can both agree they're probably better than Farsight, a somewhat useless turn 3 card that does little the turn it's played, and might ultimately make a 2 or 3 drop minion more expensive than it otherwise would have been. Nothing too compelling, but I mentioned Knight was decent before, so it's the choice. Rocketeer is quite expensive for its 5 damage removal, and Warden falls into the trap of having its stats aligned poorly. There is potential if it's buffed, but without that I can't risk it. Hex is probably the best hard removal card in the arena. The taunt is often negligible, and it's cheaper than Polymorph and Assassinate. It also doesn't have a significant downside like Naturalize does. Quite simply, it's great to have a few hexes in any Shaman deck, so I'll gladly choose it here. Frost Elemental is an okay 6-drop that can be good for tempo but has poor stats, and Worgen is a solid 1-drop but its impact is dwarfed by Hex. I wouldn't be unhappy with either card in my deck, but they aren't as strong. I felt the call of the Murloc War Leader and went with another Tidehunter. I wasn't very happy with it though, but the alternatives were underwhelming. Gurubashi can sometimes shine, and in retrospect it could have been a slightly better card here, but I generally have poor experiences with Gurubashi outside of Mage, which was why I turned it down, and I hadn't gotten too many 2-drop options prior to this point. Both are better than Ancestral Healing though, so once again we can hopefully find common ground. A hard choice, but Tiger wins it for me. I don't have any weapons to maximize Smith value at this point, and Tiger's stealth can make him quite effective since it survives most AoE removal. I've said in the past I think Tiger is underrated, and now is a good time to put my money where my mouth is. Smith is excellent too, however, and both are way better than Engineer, which is best as a late game cycle card and not really a 2-drop. I'll find cards, but Yeti is Yeti, and in Yeti we trust. Rockbiter is great as mentioned before, but I can't pass up the ideal 4-drop minion. Acolyte of Pain is a fine card, but it usually is a slow tempo play in the hopes of generating card advantage. But again, it's no Yeti. Alpha is quite good here. It's okay with Murloc Tidehunter, River Crocolisk, and Shaman Totems. Silvermoon Guardian is somewhat underwhelming, but it's alright. Rocketeer, as discussed, is expensive removal, and I think I can do better. This run has been harassed with a lot of subpar options, but I felt Weblord beats out the other two. The others fall into the 1 HP trap, which is far too easy to remove via hero ability. Weblord's body is underwhelming, but I think it might sneakily be better than folks give it credit for. It's cheaper than the other 1/4 minions you can get, so that's always a good sign. Its ability is also better, since battle cries are quite plentiful in both arena and constructed. True, the sword is double-edged, but scanning through my deck, only Twilight Drake and the 2 Tidehunters will be affected at this point. In either case, Weblord is what we had to work with here, so I'll take what I can get. I'd just like to say on record that I could have drafted 4 Dust Devils in this deck if I valued them at this point. That little tornado is trying so hard. Anyways, Stormforged Axe is excellent and cheap. Its 2 damage and overload is slightly worse than Fiery War Axe, but often you'll have enough targets in the early game to make use of those 3 charges. Ogre Magi is a perfectly acceptable 4-drop, but I don't have many spells to make use of it right now, plus I already have a few solid 4-drops, and this would be my first weapon. Another Axe, my early game just improved dramatically with these past 2 picks. Underkeeper is really strong and constructed, but I don't have enough Death Rattle to make it useful here, and besides I already have a few 1-drop things. Under no circumstances should you take Totemic Might. It does so little and is not worth the digital cardboard it was printed on. It's always going to be a supplemental card that requires other things in the field to be worthwhile, and if you ever are at the point where you can get full value from Totemic Might, the game's already all but won. Argent Commander can often be viewed as a 4/2 minion with a battle cry of deal 4 damage. That's the worst case scenario, but sometimes it can be buffed or can kill a 0 attack minion and survive with the shield still intact. It's a great card that immediately impacts the board and often generates positive card advantage. Violet Teacher is in the right deck is excellent, but I don't have too many spells and it's not better than the commander here. As to the Seer, they have a saying in Hearthstone, never go full Murloc. Even though I have 3 Murlocs already and could have had more, we need to stick with cards that are consistent, and Commander is one of the most consistent there are. If the other cards were garbage, I might have considered Seer for the synergy, but that's about it. All bad cards. Oracle can be removed from contention for its 1 HP and minimal impact. As a Shaman, I ended up going with Raid Leader. I have a better chance than most of sticking random little things on the board, and I have 2 Murloc Tidehunters already, the 2-drop that benefits most from a Raid Leader. I guess I felt like the upside of Raid Leader is better than the upside of Rifleman, whose 1 damage battle cry is rather lackluster. Archmage is beefy, and I need some more late game. Panther can often trade up, but that's usually all it can do, and I like Archmage as a more solid card. Wind Fury was discussed before and isn't a practical consideration given how it can be a dead card when you're struggling for board control. A second Hex is very welcome. Axe is great as mentioned before, but I already have 2, and with the 3 charges each, it's already unlikely I'll be able to make great use of the 6 charges available. Lord of the Arena has the body of a fire elemental, but doesn't have the amazing battlecry to make up for it. Taunt isn't a good enough perk to sway me. Raging Worgen is a solid 3 with upside, and I could use a good 3 mana minion since my deck is getting pretty full of 2s. Unstable Ghoul has anti-synergy with my 2 Murloc Tidehunters, and the fact I plan to spam the board. Goldshire Footman, more like Goldshire Fartman. A simple 1-2 taunt is usually going to throw away a card in order to save a handful of damage, not a prospect I relish. Go away, Dust Devil! Adults are trying to draft a proper Shaman deck! 2 of the top 6 drops show up to duel one another, but Fire Elemental beats Ogre. The 2 HP Ogre has is not to be overlooked because 7 HP is very hard to remove efficiently, but Fire Elemental's immediate board impact with the battlecry is simply too valuable. I love you, Ogre. No hard feelings. Bloodlust seems to fall into the too reliant on other cards column at first glance, but there are a few reasons I prefer it to say Wind Fury or other minion buffs. The first and most important is Bloodlust falls in line with what we're already trying to do naturally, which is to get a board full of stuff. I have Tidehunters, I'll be summoning totems, and I'm going to try to make my board difficult to remove completely. So when Bloodlust rolls around, I should have a few cards on board to make it worth considering. The other reason is it's pretty much a finisher that can close out a game if I've already gotten a hot start. If my opponent lost the early game and turn 5 rolls around with a Bloodlust in my hand, it could very possibly be a win outright. With 2 minions on the board, it's like a 5-mana Fireball, but with 3 minions, it's like a 5-mana Pyroblast, and anything beyond 3 minions, we're talking an absurd amount of burst damage. This card is one of the reasons smart players will clear a Shaman's board whenever possible. Having said all that, I would never want more than 2 Bloodlusts in my deck, and in fact, 2 might be one too many. A great thing to have at the right time, but not something you want clogging up your hand. Okay, anyways, onto the other cards. Forked is fine, but I have 1 already, and as mentioned above, this first Bloodlust I value quite highly. I already have plenty of early game now, and Grunt is a subpar 2-drop anyways. I talked about Earthshock before, and it's matched up against enough bad cards to be worth picking now. I just talked about how my 2 slot is already plentiful, and Patriarch is still a 1 damage junk card. Fen Creeper is the obvious choice since the others are similar to bad cards I've already talked about, either by having little in the way of attack or having 1 HP. Fen Creeper is a good taunt wall, although I would much prefer a Sludge Belcher in its place. My mid-game is shaping up nicely with another Spectral Knight. Booty Bay dies too easy, and when you compare it to the Knight, it's just a joke. Youthful Brewmaster is a decent 2, but I don't have a ton of battlecry, nor do I have a need for 2-drops at this point. Sunwalker is the only choice. I have no secrets for the Keeper, and Bloodsail Corsair's battlecry can sometimes be useful, but Sunwalker is always useful, and it's a formidable taunt wall for early game minions. Pick it without hesitation. The dust has settled, the deck is completed, and now it's time to look it over and analyze before stepping into the arena. I have a good amount of 1 and 2 drop cards, which include some weapons, some removal, and a lot of Crocs and Murlocs. Not the best minions I would ever want, but the makings are still there for a good early game, and if I can get some buffs on stuff with a Direwolf Alpha and Raid Leader, I might be able to generate value even with the less than ideal individual pieces. The mid game is where I think this deck truly shines. A Yeti and a Twilight Drake are both imposing 4-drops, and they are backed up by some Spectral Knights and a Tiger. If I'm down early, these cards should help me get a fighting chance to turn it around in the late game. My late game is decent, although I'd love another Fire Elemental or 3, or 10. Still, the quality is good enough that I should be able to push most games to victory if my early start was okay. If I could change this deck, I'd improve 2-drop minion quality, and I'd love the Lightning Storm or 2. We can't always get what we want though, and I hope my natural board presence help avoid a need for board clear. Okay, we've had the discussion, now it's time to see how your scores match up with mine. Drum roll, please. Keep in mind this is an exercise on deck drafting, and while I am an infinite arena player, I'm not always right. I do think in general people with higher scores probably assembled a better deck than people with significantly lower scores, but being a few points different from me doesn't mean your deck sucks. In fact, you might have had a slightly better deck than me if you weren't swayed by the wiles of Murlocs like I was. Well, there you go, the draft is completed. Now all that's left is to take this deck for a spin. What do you guys predict from this deck? Will I live the Murloc dream, or will I face the War Leader nightmare? Will I get Bloodlust value, or will it languish in my hand? Will Raid Leader find any use? And what's up with all those Dust Devils? Stay tuned for the conclusion video next week where I reveal the deck's end score and walk through the particularly memorable events of this arena run. Comments and suggestions are always welcome, so please let me know at HearthstonePlayers.com or directly on the YouTube video. In addition to these arena quiz videos, I'm also making a bunch of videos found only in the YouTube channel, ranging from Mohr Arena to Constructed to Nex Ramus. If you like this video and want to see more, I strongly suggest subscribing to Hearthstone Players channel for more content, and my personal YouTube channel for other games I'll be recording. Thanks again, and as always, I've been MrShine, and I'll see you next time!